Isabel is also affiliated with the University of Cambridge, and I'm just delighted really to introduce her to take us through this next session, so thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much and good afternoon. Just a bit about me. As you heard, I worked in government and regulation, then I became the first CEO of Ofqual, the regulator of exams and qualifications in England. And then in 2011 I went to work for 3 years in Singapore for Cambridge International Examinations, came back, and then the government set up a thing called the A-Level Content Advisory Board for universities to advise on the content of A-Levels, and I was Muggins in charge of that. But then it got demolished when the government didn't like the advice that we gave very much. But never mind, that was all very interesting. And I am on the board of the university here, and also on the board of another university, the University College of Osteopathy. And I'm particularly interested in ethics and ethical issues, and I'm on 2 government committees advising on ethics. One is the Home Office's Biometrics and Forensics Ethics Advisory Group, and the other one is the National Statisticians Data Ethics Group. So I've just got papers this afternoon for a meeting on Monday about big data and ethical issues about that. So that's where I'm coming from. And I'm also affiliated to the Faculty of Education at Cambridge, which is sort of euphemism for no money, but I get a desk and that sort of thing. And I'm working with a colleague there on a book, which is my next chapter is overdue, about fairness in assessment, looked at from different angles, including legal and philosophical angles as well as practical ones. And in some ways it's a theoretical question, a theoretical topic, but it's an idea that causes enormous emotion. I remember reading a letter from a parent of a 6-year-old girl who said, "It's not fair" is my daughter's favourite phrase, and there's something very basic about a feeling of fairness. And if any of you have gone onto Twitter after your students have been sitting GCSEs or A-levels and read such moderate statements as, "It was so unfair I went to throw up in the toilet," and things like this, which is quite common. There's a very deep feeling of fairness being something that matters a lot. And in particular, I want to put together 2 trends that are quite difficult for us to think about. One is that for those who work on educational assessment, in fact there has been an awful lot of discussion about fairness and some theoretical work and practical work about fairness in assessment. Generally, the assessment geeks talk about the big 2 values for assessments, validity and reliability. But now they talk about the big 3, and then some of them earn a living by wondering whether fairness is just a type of validity, but I'm not going to talk about that, you'll be relieved to hear. But those who use this book, this American textbook, as a kind of definition of best practice in assessment, will find that the latest edition had a completely new chapter in the beginning for about 40 pages, entirely about fairness, because of the importance that it has. But against that, there's increasing worry about the context in which assessments are used, whether these are in-school assessments or things like GCSEs and A-levels for school leavers, and a feeling generally that the world in which this assessment is trying to be fair is increasingly unfair, and a lot of worry about the use made of the assessments that your students are sitting. I share an office in Cambridge with visiting scholars from other countries, and there was a lady from Spain who, when she heard that I worked with assessment, she said, "You know, I almost gave up teaching because I thought assessment was so unfair." That was the phrase that she used. And I'm going to talk particularly about the use of end-of-school exam results, like GCSEs and A-levels, as a criterion for university entrance, and if that is fair to do, and then what that means about the fairness of the assessment itself. So can a national exam be fair if the context in which it's used is unfair? And are there options we could do, we being society at large, could do to solve this problem? Briefly, I'm going to say a little bit about the concept of fairness, what it means, and a little bit about fairness in assessment, what the received views about what that actually constitutes and whether it's right. I'm going to talk about some challenge from the courts, and one court case from America, which you may have heard of, you may not have, but it provokes quite a lot of questions for us. And then talk about this issue about inequality in access to university using A-levels or equivalent as a criterion. Can I just ask, has anybody here worked as an examiner or worked with any of the exam boards? Yes, there are quite a lot of you. So you'll have seen something of their end of the process, which we're all talking about. Well, when you think about fairness, and remember that before coffee, you heard about the boy who wrote, "It's fair for a teacher not to have to be working at bedtime." Well, I wonder what he meant. I think it was a he. What he meant by fairness in that concept. I think there's at least 4 senses in which you could say something's fair, and it's always worth asking when you get, it's not fair, what do you mean by that? One is a formal sense, that it's accurate or it follows some rubric correctly. So, if there's rules of a game or a sport and the referee blows his whistle, then you say, well, that was fair because that rule was broken. You're not saying it's a morally fine rule or anything like that. You're just saying that that was a reasonable thing to do. There's an important sense, which I've called contractual, where something's fair if it meets the reasonable expectations of somebody. So, for example, if one of your students was sitting an exam and there was something in it that they had no idea would be the kind of thing they'd be asked to do at all, they often come out and say, that wasn't fair, we didn't know we would have to do so and so. And that's an issue about reasonable expectations. But the third sense is what I've called relational, which you might think is the main one, which is that relevantly like cases are treated alike. So that if you have one student who's got this level of ability in mathematics and another one, that they broadly be treated the same in the assessment. Nobody, I think, thinks that a fair assessment is one where everybody gets the same mark. It's not precisely equality necessarily, but there must be a relevant reason for differences, and those that are relevantly similar should be treated the same. And it's a bit like the golden rule, treat others as you want to be treated yourself. The idea of being a relational thing. And the last one I've called retributive, which is that it's fair if candidates get the grades they so-called deserve. You hear this a lot from parents, for example. Well, I think that was a fair mark because my son worked very hard, or that he finds this very difficult, so I can see that it's fair. It's something to do with a right response to what was put in. There's lots of other variants in that, but these, I think, are the 4 main ones. And the one that people tend to think of as the only one is this relational, treating one person like another person. And I'm going to suggest it's a bit deeper than that. Here's an example. Now, some of you may remember this with some despair. In 2012, there was an enormous row about the grades in GCSE English in the June exam. It was still a modular exam then. And to cut a very, very long story short, there was a feeling that the grades in the June modules were lower than all the teachers, most of the teachers and the students expected. And there was a feeling that they had a right to expect that the same standards would be applied to the June modules as to the January ones, because there were January ones then as well. And so that they felt they had a legitimate expectation that they would get marked more generously than they were. And also, this was an issue about relational fairness. There was a question that these January students were treated more generously than the June ones, so it wasn't fair. This lot of students got treated differently in a relevant respect than this lot. The problem being that according to the regulator, and I was away in Singapore, so it wasn't me, but according to the regulator and the exam boards, in fact, it was the January ones, which were much smaller numbers, that were treated too generously. And if you're going to be relational with the year before, and possibly the year after, then somebody's got to give, and it would probably be the June ones. And that is a very potted history, a very complicated picture. But you were either going to have to shunter the whole standards down forever, ever after, or you're going to have to try and readjust in some way. But there were these 2 senses of fair that was in that case. Well, now, the fairness of what, when you're saying the exam's not fair? Well, there's aspects of the test or the assessment itself that people might say are issues of fairness in the senses I've said. The type of assessment used. Is it the extended answer or multiple choice? There's often a rather uncritical feeling that multiple choice is fairer because there's less discretion for for examiners, but on the other hand, others feel that they have a legitimate expectation of a chance to show the richness of their answers. So there's different views. Exams versus portfolios, one-off versus modules. And then when you get into the design and the whole examining process, you've got the design of the exam, the question paper development, the mark and the grading scheme and the criteria for each grade, the administration, the marking, the scoring, the reporting of the outcomes. All these things can have fairness issues adapted to them. And then you have the uses made of the assessment outcomes. And there's an example, for example, to back up people's applications for university or in their applications for employment. So these, and also it could be for progression to another stage of further or a sixth form college or further education. And then there's the question, fairness to whom? Now, it's usually assumed that this is entirely about fairness to the candidates. Here's an unfair example, to the candidates, and that's all it's about. Well, what about fairness to their peers, perhaps people who didn't sit the exam because they didn't think they could? Or what about users of the assessment outcome, like employers or people doing university admissions? Or what about society at large? Is there fairness to them? And when you get competency tests, I used to work in medical education, and there's a big issue about that if somebody was qualified as a doctor, their patients had a right to expect that they were competent. And it was unfair on them if this assessment was not rigorous and careful. And similarly, if you give money to an accountant to do your tax affairs, you have a right to expect him or her to be competent. So maybe there's fairness to you, and it'd be unfair to you if that person had not been properly assessed. Now, the theorists, the assessment theorists, and again, for every assessment theorist, you have at least two views. So this is just an attempt to describe the broad consensus about what it's about. They tend to assume that fairness is about candidates, and it's not about other people. And usually they will say that unfairness is linked to bias in some way. And what this unpacks into is that the outcomes for different groups of candidates, for example, boys or girls, or if poor candidates or rich candidates, something like that, varied because of some construct irrelevant attribute, not because they were better at mathematics, but some other attribute like their gender or their disability or whatever. And the good practice is to minimize the risk of this kind of construct irrelevant bias at the design stage as early as possible in the process. For example, in the wording of tasks and questions, avoiding words which are unfamiliar to some. What is the area of this patio? Well, a lot of students would have no idea what a patio was, never seen one in their lives. Others would think it's quite a familiar word. So there's those who have the knack of spotting these kind of things, as you may have done if you've been working with the exam boards, can spot these. But it's easy to bring them in without thinking. The presentation of the assessment itself, including very practical things like the colour of diagrams, the print size, the audibility of recorded speech. Any of you who are involved with modern language teaching will have happy memories in the days of crummy cassettes, of crackly recordings of bits of French that the people were supposed to understand. And really it wasn't fair because of the poor quality. The arrangements for the administration of the test, including provision for candidates with disabilities, and all that kind of good practice is wound up with phrases, the Americans call it universal design, designing something from the start that's going to be accessible for everybody. And the Brits tend to talk about fairness by design or fair access by design. And there's a very, very good booklet by the regulators called Fair Access by Design, which is full of things like font sizes and colours and how to do a diagram that you don't have to read like that and all the rest of it, and it's a win-win because the view is if it's needed for some students, it's actually better for everybody to have clear type and good diagrams. So that's really unarguable and it's good practice. In arrears, what the theorists do is to try to investigate possible unfairness in a statistical way by comparing the outcomes of groups that they've identified as having similar relevant ability in the construct through some other measure, but differentiated by other characteristics like gender or the socioeconomic groups or race, for example. So it would be quite common in America to take Native American candidates or a Hispanic candidates and compare them with white candidates and the like. And then you do a comparative analysis called differential function analysis, and you try to see whether there's any difference that isn't to do with the thing you're supposed to be measuring. And so do it in advance with good design and in arrears by this statistical analysis. Well, is that good? I think what I would say would be that this approach focuses on what I call relational fairness without asking why it matters. Why does it matter so much that one candidate is treated exactly the same way as another? Now, I know your students will say, it's not fair if it isn't, but unpacking that, why do we feel so strongly about that? And perhaps that sense of unfairness is weaker if there's no competitive access to some limited good, like a very competed for university place or something like that. The model neglects this legitimate expectations sense, which I suggest is really quite strong for your students, and doesn't really sit easily with competency tests, which are a different type of thing. And I suggest that in thinking about exams and assessments, that we're all rather guilty of favouring one kind of paradigm rather than another. And the paradigm I think we all think about, I've called the cake. There it is. That fairness is about distribution or access to limited goods like this cake. And if you get a slice of the cake, you're not going to get it. So you're the winner and you're the loser. And the emphasis is on differentiating between your students, between candidates. And that's what relational fairness is all about. In fact, I've heard lectures, including at Cambridge, from people saying the purpose of assessment is differentiating between candidates. That's what they say. So it is all about slicing up the cake in a fair way so that you get the right slice and you get the right slice, and you can't say he's got a bigger slice than me. But another paradigm, which is different from a cake, is a proficiency test. Now, I don't think you can read that. This is a Singaporean thing, and these are the criteria for the Singaporean swimming proficiency badges. And being Singaporean, they're very organised in all of this, very strictly assessed. If you get different types of badge, different colours, and it's got a name, this is the sea lion, this is the tuna badge, the stingray, the dolphin, the shark, the whale. And those are the times you've got to make in the different strokes to get the different badges. So you've got to do front crawl for 50 metres in less than a minute for getting the green badge. And you've got to do 1,500 metres in less than 40 minutes to get the whale, which is the best thing you can be. But the point about that is it's assessment against defined standards of performance, but it's not about, the main purpose is not to differentiate between you and you. And if everybody was a whale, then I think the Singaporean authorities would be very pleased. In fact, they'd be quite upset if they didn't have very high numbers of whales. And the emphasis is on accuracy in the assessment against the standard and motivation of the students. If you're just a dolphin, you want to become a stingray, or whichever way it is. A stingray, I want to become a dolphin. And that's what the emphasis is, rather than on differentiating between students as being a point. And I think if we think of the Singaporean test a little bit more than the cake, then it helps us a little bit to think about fairness in a different way. Now, I'm going to talk quickly about a court case, and this is an American court case, but I'll suggest that it's got some relevance for us. Has anybody ever heard of this case? Has it been anything to anybody? Okay. It was in Florida, and the complainant was called Deborah P., but she was just one of a number of students and their parents and supporters. A whole group of them brought a collective action, and it went to the courts 4 times. And what happened was the state of Florida was concerned about educational standards, rings a bell, and they decided that they would add to the things you had to do, students had to do to get their high school diploma. And in America, a high school diploma is a big deal. If you don't get that, you really can't get a decent job at all. And high school diplomas normally having completed the requirements of the various classes. But they decided in 1976 they wanted to add something which they called a functional literacy test, which is rather like the things you may remember as functional skills tests and various things like that, about basic functional literacy and numeracy. And they would claim that it should, the kind of things that students should be able to do at the end of primary, really. It was about the level they were talking about. And then the new test was developed and quickly developed and piloted and introduced in 1977, just over a year later. And that was the result. Now, if you look at the proportion of black students who failed against the proportion of white students who failed, it's rather striking what the difference is. There's a huge difference. And even over a longer period, it was calculated that the likelihood of a white student failing was 1/10 of the likelihood of a black student failing. So it's a huge, huge difference. And this led to a legal challenge on behalf of the black students, and also another one in behalf of all the students who failed. But we'll just talk about the black ones. And what the court initially found was that the students were denied what they were entitled to expect, because they'd gone right through school thinking, what I do to get my diploma is finish all my classes, and blah, blah, blah. And then suddenly this thing came in, which was totally new to them, and that the black students could have been denied due process by not being taught all the content tested. And in saying that, they were looking back to the history of education in Florida, which was quite historically segregated between black schools and white schools. And they told the education department they couldn't make the diploma dependent on this exam until 4 years' time, when there was time for the students, all the students, to be taught more about it. Both parties appealed, and the appeal judgment backed up the original, but said they required the state to carry out research on whether the content of these functional skills was actually being taught, not whether it was supposed to be taught, but whether it was actually being taught. And then there was a survey. The state did an expensive survey of every single school in Florida, and then with those massive results, great files of it, the court eventually decided that they could make the test a condition for a diploma as long as they offered remediation and resits and extra tuition for people who failed. So that was the story of Deborah P. and Turlington. But the important thing is that they invented a concept in this case, which the American appeal court said that validity is not just about testing something that you're supposed to be testing, but it's what they called curricular validity, and then they later sometimes called it instructional validity. It's things that are currently taught. They got all the lecturers, the experts in the court, Professor so-and-so said, oh, it was reliable and it was valid, but he agreed that everything on the test might not have been taught. He couldn't put his hand on his heart and say it had been. And this is what the judgment said. I won't read it out. 11th hour with virtually no warning, though, so it's a bit of emotion here. They were suddenly told that the requirements had been changed. We believe that the state administered a test that was fundamentally unfair, in that it may have covered matters not taught in the schools. So, that's interesting, but is it any relevance for us in the UK? Because we don't have a constitutional legal system of the same kind. Well, I suggest to you that this idea of curricular validity, of actually testing things that really have been taught, is relevant to us. And when we're thinking, for example, of the revision and renewal of GCSEs and A-levels, and pressure to try and do this a very, very quick turnaround time, some of those remarks might ring home. Now, the question for our system, when all the responsibilities for bits along the chain are all divided up, is who is responsible for this? Is it the exam boards, or is it the schools? Is it the government? Is it Ofqual? Who is it that's responsible for seeing that these matters really are taught before you make students' futures depend on the exam? And I should add that I'm also on the board of Qualifications Wales, which is a sort of Ofqual for Wales. And they've got an extra issue. They're always being pressed to keep up with the very quick speed of exam reform in England, but it takes ages for the curriculum to be agreed for these new GCSEs, for example, and then it takes a while for textbooks and other support material to be prepared. But then you've got to get Welsh language textbooks and support material, and that takes longer still. And there's always pressure to rush it in before the Welsh medium schools have had a chance to be taught it properly. So in a sense, I think that is instructional validity in this sense that the Americans talked about. So there's real issues about fairness there that's looking at it from a different angle. And I'm going to move now, just to finish off, with this question that I asked about at the beginning. It's about access to higher education and the use of A-level outcomes or the equivalent of BTECs or other end-of-school qualifications for university entrance. Now, I've just selected some examples from other countries to say this is not just a British issue or an American one. It's really a global problem. And there's problems about the children of rich parents or parents who have educational participation tend to do better. The next generation of those who've climbed the ladder tend to get a start up the ladder. And that happens in most societies there. And the poor children, the children who have less opportunity, are defined in different ways. You'll see in China there's a real issue about rurality and children from rural areas. In India, issues about income brackets, but the same problem is there. Some groups have a much better chance, a much better start, and they have much less access to higher education. In the UK and the USA, there's a suggestion that these gaps are actually widening rather than getting better, and particularly not the gaps in the middle between the slightly advantaged and the slightly disadvantaged. Those are coming together more, but it's between the top group and the bottom group. And this is found both in the United States and here. And there's just a few quotes I've given there from the UK, including issues about the persistently disadvantaged that the Educational Policy Institute talked about, those eligible for school meals for 80% or longer of their school lives, over 2 years behind their peers in average by the end of secondary school. Now there's issues about how you measure that and all the rest of it, but the concept is there. The differences in those who achieve high A-level grades, and then the question that equal examination grades don't necessarily reflect equal potential, whatever potential is. They only reflect equal performance at a particular point in time, and you've got some that have got a start compared to the others. And the findings in the United States include by Professor Putnam that the poor kids who succeed academically, so they've got good grades despite being poor, even they are less likely to graduate from college than rich kids who had low grades. So there's something going on, and it seems not to be confined to educational issues. You get similar findings when you're looking at health, looking at a participation, income, employment, and experience of family breakdown. There seems to be this dividing of the ways between the top group and the bottom group. So, what does this mean about fair exams? Well, let's, for the moment, I know you could debate all day about these quotes and whether they're correct, but if we accept them just for half an hour, that they're accurate, and we consider that state of affairs, I feel very uncomfortable about what I've read in that, and I think it's unfair. It's unfair on these poor, disadvantaged students. Are the outcomes of the assessments themselves, the A-levels, where the rich ones seem to get higher grades than the poor ones, are those fair? And what are the limits to the fair use of end-of-school assessments, and what can be done about it? Well, I'm going to suggest 2 ways for you to go away with that something could be done about it. I suggest that you will probably hate both of them, and that's fine, but once you've said, well, those were dreadful, we'd never do those, what do you want to do is my question, if you don't want to do these. So quickly, the ones you're going to hate. This is one. You could give extra marks or set lower grade thresholds for those that are identified as disadvantaged. So, for example, those who've been on free school meals for over 80% of their school career. So the pass mark for them is 40% and the pass mark for the others is 50%. You could do that. Now, you may think, what a ridiculous idea, but it's not. In Ireland, there's a thing called the Irish Premium. So if you're an Irish student, you sit your leaving certificate in Ireland. If you sit it in the language of Irish, you can get up to 10 extra marks for doing so, in subjects such as geography and physics and other subjects, not just in language subjects, for sitting it in Irish. So, and that's been the case for many years. However, I would suggest that you would need to be awfully clear what the reason for this action was. Is it compensation for some difference in prior educational opportunities, rather like a handicap race when some people start a bit further up front? Is it a different definition of the construct you're assessing? Is it assessing on potential in some definition rather than achievement or performance? Or is it about motivation for disadvantaged students to give them? Because in fact, the reason for this Irish premium, insofar as there was a reason, was largely motivation. I thought it would motivate students to take the Irish language seriously and to use it. Whether it did that is another question. And depending on the justification, you could then test it empirically about whether it was achieving what you're trying to achieve, like greater participation by the disadvantaged or increased motivation. However, if you were wanting to use the exam grades as a measure of social inequality or equality, tinkering with the grades themselves is a very bad way to do it. I was brought up as a regulator to say, if you want to measure change, don't change the measure. And it seems a pretty good maxim to use. And of course, there'd be huge practical problems in implementing the definition of the groups and how you define the opportunities for cheating, gaming the system. And I ask each of you to imagine yourself sitting in a room with outraged parents of students who were set a more taxing pass mark than their neighbour was, and they know that their neighbour cheated all the time and pretended they had free school meals when they hadn't. You can just imagine it, and it's not a happy prospect. And there could be an effect on confidence in the system as a whole. What King called consistent score, meaning across groups, seems a bit geeky, but it means that people have some faith and trust in the whole thing. So there's quite a lot of problems with my first option, so we might drop that. The next one is to set different grade requirements for university entrance from different groups. To say that if there's competition for a particular course, for some groups you've got to get 3 Bs and others you get 3 Cs or something like that. And there are examples of recent reports in the UK that have recommended this. One I mentioned in Scotland, when they're saying instead of trying to have differential and to set high requirements as a means of differentiating, you should set the requirement at the basic, the minimum level required for successful completion of the course. And there was this article published by the Higher Education Policy Institute saying that 3 A's for some students are the equivalent of 3 C's for other students. Now, supposing you said, if you're a disadvantaged student, you can get into this course with 3 C's, but if you're an advantaged student, you've got to have 3 A's, which was more or less what that was recommending. Well, one objection would be that you're lowering standards, dumbing down. This is unacceptable. But not, say the authors, if you're measuring potential, because we saw how the whole group had fallen behind by 2 years. So if you're looking at the potential to do well in the future, maybe they are equivalent. Setting them up to fail, which was a very fair point to make. And in fact, even the authors of the Higher Education Policy Report said, well, there is a bit in that, but there is a need for continual support for these students during their time at university. And is it fair doing that or unfair? Well, I think one thing would depend on what your criteria are for your selection for a higher education course. Is it you're trying to pick people who are capable of completing the course and not dropping out? Is it those who are likely to get the best outcome in the course? Is it potential for being an outstanding scholar in a subject, a real mathematician or a good geographer or whatever? What about those who have the most to gain from being at university or from the course? And it could be that some of the disadvantaged students would have the most to gain. In this university, we talk about one of our maxims is transforming lives. And I do think that does happen. You talk to students who've just the first from their family to go to university, whose lives have been completely changed by their experience here. Is that what you're looking for? And if you're looking for suitability for a profession like medicine or law, which are very competitive often in their entry, perhaps you should be looking at the profession's needs and rather than the A-level outcomes. The Medical Royal Colleges have tried to make a list of the attributes of a good doctor, and they've suggested that selection should look for evidence of those. It's very difficult to find evidence of some, like empathy and things like that, but at least, that's a different lot of criteria. And I think I would suggest the validity of use of the A-level grades in this way would depend on the criteria. Now, if the rules were clear and applied accurately, and it was absolutely clear and public, a secret thing, like if you remember the Japanese, you may have read, they had a secret different class threshold for women candidates, but for medicine, because they wanted to reduce the numbers. But if this was open and set down and applied accurately, it would be formally fair in the sense But what about relational fairness, treating relevantly like cases alike? What about the student from a well-off family with grades of B, B and B, who's rejected in favour of a poor student who has C, C and C? And what would you say to their parent when they came to a parents' night, or was on school governors? Is it fair to the well-off student? I've talked to the parents of students who are highly privileged, go to schools like Westminster School in London, saying it's very difficult for my son because all this selection is giving special treatment for people from state schools, for example. Well, maybe that's right that they should give special attention, but is it fair in relational sense? And then I would suggest there's a problem because we're obsessed with this cake paradigm. We think that it's all about competitive access to limited goods and bits of the cake, and my son with a BBB is being rejected in favour of this poor child with a CCC. Now, it is the case that for some forms of higher education there is a lot of competition for limited places, like medical school and some courses at Oxbridge and the like. But there's an awful lot where there aren't. A lot of universities are what we call recruiting universities and are competing like mad with each other to attract students. And what they want, more than just trying to differentiate from a lot of highly qualified students, is rich information about the students that are applying, so they're going to benefit from the course. So maybe that in that kind of context, the relational fairness may not be so important. And that's a quote from the philosopher R.M. Hare. Sometimes it's impossible to be absolutely fair in this imperfect world without transgressing some even more important duty. So personally, I'm a little less hostile to the second of these options, although I think it raises a lot of questions. Now that's the outline of what I've been talking about, and the conclusions I will leave with you. I think when an exam or a test is called unfair, if you feel it's unfair, or your students feel it's unfair, or their parents feel it's unfair, and that happens frequently, we need to ask what that means, because it's only then you can unpack it really and find out what this is really about. I would suggest to you that the relational sense of fair, treating relevantly like cases alike, is not the only sense that matters, that we've got to think of these Singaporeans and their proficiency badge as well as the cake. Now, the other thing I would say to you is that in this country, the exam system for end-of-school exams is very broken up with different actors at different stages. There's teachers in your schools, there's the people when you've been examiners yourself or when you've written exam papers. We've got then the markers, and then we've got the standardisers, and we've got the accountable officers, and we've got the regulators, and we've got everybody else. And we think of it all in different roles. We talk about Ofqual and the government and the local authority and the governors. But for the student, that whole experience is a continuum, and they will look at whether that whole experience was fair. And although we may say, well, that bit is nothing, the grading was absolutely nothing to do with me, that was about Ofqual, that was their fault, or changing the exam too quickly was nothing to do with me, that was the government, you can blame them. And we used to say, blame Mrs. Thatcher for everything, but it's a little late for that. But that sort of idea. Now, I would suggest to you that, of course, we've got responsibility for our bit, but we also have a responsibility to contribute to thinking about the big picture for our students, including this difficult question of different meanings of exam outcomes for different students from different backgrounds, not just about our specific part, because life's a bit broader than that. And because fairness is something that matters. It may be a theoretical idea in a sense, that it's a concept, but it isn't half a concept that we care about. And that's why it's very important when we're thinking about assessment to think carefully about fairness. That's it. Thank you.
I just wonder if anyone's got any comments or questions, queries?
Yeah, I was intrigued as well, because you talked about your involvement with this big data.
Yes, yes.
And it strikes me that one possible outcome, maybe I'm being naive, of big data is more objectivity. And if as a result we come into a future where decisions about outcomes are taken on more objective measures than they were in the past, that we have less need to worry about fairness.
Yes, I mean, the big data thing is really interesting because the potential to have rich data about your students, about almost every aspect of their teaching and learning, and then to combine it in different ways is endless, and because of the potential of big data and its use. The issue is really how you decide on the categorization of it and the analysis of it, and that's where it could be that the days of exams would be over, that it's a question of continuous watching of students in every aspect of their teaching and learning, and then drawing structured conclusions about it is what assessment is. But which bits do you take? So if you take something that's what they call progressive learning, like a language or something like that, when you get better at it as you go along, is it fair to use bits from the beginning? And what about people feeling safe to try things out? There's also an issue about the privacy and the safety and the dignity of the students as well. I went to a conference where a speaker from Holland spoke with enormous pride about an experiment in a primary school where, I think, 6-year-olds, where they had special cameras and heat cameras so that they filmed and they showed every action by all the children for the whole day, including expressions in their faces and what they said to their friends and everything. And they drew conclusions for teaching and learning. There was a lady sitting from Scandinavia sitting next to me in the audience, and she just turned around to me and said very quietly, "I will not send my daughter to that school," she said, because, it's an issue. I did stick my hand up and ask about whether they got consent of the parents and what about the freedom of the children and all that. So there are issues of that, but I would suggest that in terms of validity also for a lot of activities, you get much better validity if you're seeing things in a more real context than this quartered off bit of an exam room. So in medicine there's a lot of discussion about using portfolios for people training to be GPs where they're actually treating patients rather than just writing about treating patients. And that seems to be, and it used to be terribly expensive to do that, but it's now, cameras are so easy for students to take films of what they're doing. So I think with the big data thing, if you think about it enough, it could mean the end of exams, and it could be that exams are a conclusion. All I would say is I don't think it solves the question of fairness in one fell swoop, because there's fairness in the conclusion as well. That's my feeling, but it's an open question. Yes?
As you were talking, I was thinking, reflecting on children that have been taken into care.
Yes,
well,
yes.
Care. And they could be seen as a community that you all agree have a significant advantage. And I wondered whether that was an area that could legitimately be looked at in the
Absolutely.
Because we're looking at young people who have had interruption in their education and trauma that everybody agrees is affecting their outcomes. All the evidence shows that. So it would be a really good target group to...
It's an excellent target group. I think that one of the things we're going to find in this century is that the ways that we developed in the 20th century of looking at fairness among the discrimination legal groups like disability and race and things are going to become much more nuanced. Races are all mixed now, and also the range of disabilities is very varied, and it's much better looking at individuals, and also the fact that the kinds of disadvantage being clustered. For example, Professor Putnam suggests that there's a link between educational outcomes and the number of times that people have had a meal in the family, sitting down around a table, and all that kind of thing. This suggests that the growing up in care is a clear issue, and it's one of many, and I think it's a very important one.
I think thinking about those children particularly, that their journey is not fair in the first place. So society might have to do something about that rather than keep measuring them as underachieving.
Yes, and realising that what brings them to these differential starting points is not necessarily anything to do with school, it's to do with the family, and the same as with the high achievers. I was talking to some undergraduates here earlier this week about international comparisons with Singapore and places. And it's not just about what happens in the schools. You've got private tuition for a start, but even apart from that, the whole issue of the family culture, the reinforcement in the family, and that's where there is a family, And so all these factors are important. It's the experience curriculum, not the prescribed one. Yes?
I was relating that back now to primary, and the test that you have at the end of year 6, and the limited area of a child's learning that does. I recently had a friendly Ofsted, which was basically they were trying out their new framework on our schools. And it was interesting because it was very much more focused on the wider picture and the whole curriculum. And so we were able to produce evidence like, our children, we have a band that comes, they play the drums and this, and the confidence that gives the children, and they're able to see them being able to speak in public things. So I'm hoping that will be much more the focus, the whole bigger picture, than that terribly narrow focus, which was what most of these tests test. And when you think of the difference between children who end up going to a private school, it's not the exams that make them so successful, it's the fact they're empowered to think they are the best, and therefore they have that confidence maybe to go and speak out in public and things like that. So it's those differences you were talking about.
Yes, I think that's it. They're all clustered together.
Yeah.
That's right. And the other thing, I was talking to my co-author of this book, that it's often assumed that fairness is only about what they call high-stakes assessments, things that, like GCSEs and A-levels and things. I think we would suggest that there's also fairness issues in informal feedback, informative assessment as well. I'm a quite keen musician, and I often meet up with people, and if I say, I'm going to sing at a concert or something, I will get stories from middle-aged men that they were told by their primary teacher when they were 6 that they couldn't sing, and that they were spoiling it for everybody else, and they had to mime at the concert because otherwise they'd be spoiling it for the others. And it's gone with them for their entire life. And usually that's just based on the fact that the teacher had no idea about how young boys' voices actually work. And it was a hugely unfair assessment. And it had a big effect on them. It took a whole area of enjoyment out of their lives. There were these 50-year-old men telling me this word for word what their teacher told them when they were 6. And I'm sure it was just an informal comment. It wasn't an exam. So these things can have fairness issues as well.
I think as well, you said there, it's about success criteria. And if we look at us as learners, children, our baseline is not the same.
Yes.
And if I said to you, should we go and climb Mount Everest tomorrow?
I think you'd agree.
You say to me, and so it's like, and it's breaking those steps up and actually, and if this pupil's learning is here, and this baseline, this pupil's here, and we expect them to be the same, so the quality is not the same, it can be different models, but to have the same effect, as in moving on learning. And, knowing, well, actually, this child here, I know has difficulties or emotional, whatever, I'm going to use this approach because I know if I use this approach, this will be to get success, which might look a different model from using this particular child here. But I know parents go, well, that's not fair. So you've let that child out to get away with it. Why are they allowed to do that?
And I think to which the answer to that parent is, why do you mind?
Yes.
Why do you mind if that child is being helped? Now, if they're both applying for medical school in London, for which there are 200 applications for 40 places, I can understand that, but they're not, most people are not. Thinking about the application for courses here, which are of high value, yes, people have to achieve levels, but in fact there are lots of varieties of experience, and it should not matter to parent A that the children of parent B came through a different
I
route.
think what it is they're not away with it. Why can they do that?
Yes.
My child can't do it. Why? It's that they can get away. They can seemingly do whatever they want to do. It's different rules. Why are they different rules? The rules should be the same.
Personal outrage, isn't it?
And there's this issue about gaming the system or playing a function of the system. If you look internationally at the figures for numbers of students or percentages of students who get special assessment arrangements for psychological disabilities, assessed by a psychologist or whatever, there's something like double in upper middle class and higher class areas than in other classes. Now there's two reasons, it could be two reasons. One is that there's all this under diagnosis in poor areas of psychological disabilities. The other one is that the parents are trying to get the maximum advantage for their students. You don't blame them for that, because they're trying to help their own children. But the statistics are absolutely striking, because because there was almost double. And so there's a bit of both trends, I think. And there's worry because, and my sort of straw person idea of having different pass marks, the options for gaming that system are quite great. And it's
I wonder the reality that, you know, I think there's going to be a very small percentage who actually go out potentially to game and to...
Yes, I'm not, it's an unfair, and they want to do the best for their son or
But
daughter.
that's an intentional, that takes planning, that takes involvement to do that, which in itself you could argue is quite clever.
And it's the parents who have the time and the resource to do that, and not doing 3 jobs to keep their children fed and that kind of thing, have more option to do that. When I was in Singapore, there was a website called kiasuparents.com. Kiasu is a Chinese word for risk averse, and they were wanting to make sure that their children had the best possible advantages, the best possible schools. They all exchanged emails with each other. So when they have selection after primary school, the sort of 11 plus sort of exam in Singapore, the primary school leaving exam, and the ministers are trying to pull back from that a little bit, but the Kiasu parents wanted a word for it. They stopped publishing the marks of the top scorers in Singapore, so they published, all the Kiasu parents got them and published them on their website instead. So there are movements of that are quite difficult to deal with, but I think that may just be life, you know, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try things. And this question about assuming that always my child is competing against your child is just not realistic. The more that our whole world of employment and work is much more disaggregated, and people are going to move from job to job, and that it's much more about rich information about the individual and less about winners and losers. But there's always going to be some that are different.
Something you mentioned there just made me think that the other problem with the whole system is that you have to be assessed at certain times and a certain age, whereas actually some children might be ready for that in 2 years' time, but not at that particular time.
Yes.
And boys and girls, but always you have to assess them then, and then, and if you don't get through that, then you can't get to university because that window is as long, unless you go through a different type of route altogether. But maybe that's another thing that should be looked
Well,
at.
it may loosen up. There's always been this distinction between age and stage. And it may be, I mean, in fact, the proportion of people coming to university aged over 21 has gone up in the last 20 years or so. But it may be that we're going to a more cyclical model, where people are going to have to reskill regularly as they move on from one area of work to another.
And my primary curriculum is just, it's firmly established now, age-related expectation.
Yes.
And I still have not found what a typical year-old
No.
Yes, is that what the difference is between age-old and
It's
age-old?
probably not school.
Somebody else thought. Then, you know, that concerns me that we're not. We're moving more into that kind of
Yes.
environment and more away from it.
You may have watched the television discussion about access to disturbing things on social media for young children. And there was this girl being interviewed with her mother, and they said, well, Facebook it says this is only open to people aged 13. For instance, the mother said, well, my daughter will be 13 next year. Does that mean it's all right for her? Now, this idea that you have these clunking stages, it seems. And in Wales, there's been a big issue about early entry to GCSEs, about people really spending the whole of their time after Key Stage 3 just preparing for GCSEs. And this suggestion that it was largely for accountability reasons in the schools rather than... But there were some students for whom it was a good time to do it because they could, particularly the high achievers, because they could then move on more quickly. So there's, again, it's very difficult to categorise by that. I'm realising you're wanting to get back through the snow.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.